In this video, we're going to be looking at Nuke's shader system and lights, 3D lights. And we're going to use this basic scene that we put together with the sphere and cube. And we're going to apply some shaders to this and some lights so we could kind of get a grasp of what those things are. So to begin with, what we want to do is we want to create a couple constants to use as a shader for these objects. What we're going to do is grab a constant, and if we view this right now, it's obviously black, but what we could do is set some colors to this. So maybe we could set one of these to be kind of on the greenish side. So we'll go 0.5 for the green, 0.5 for the blue. Maybe I'll bring green down a little bit and put a little bit of red. Something like that for, actually we'll go a little bit more green. Yeah, let's say something like that. So that'll be our shader to use for the cube, the ground plane. And I'll just clone this guy, and we could set a color for our sphere. So maybe our sphere can be a little bit more on the orange side. So we could give it a little bit more red and a little bit more blue. Sorry, a little bit more green. Something like that. And we'll set this for the texture color for our sphere. So I'm just going to make sure we're outputting an alpha as well. So we'll set the alpha on that. Say close. So then this way we have an alpha channel as well. And I'll do the same thing for our constant. I'll set this to RGBA and set our alpha to 1. And there we go. So there's a few ways of applying materials to this. One way is you could go directly by plugging the constant into your geometry. But another way we could do this is using a node called apply material. And if we grab this, it's got an input and a material input. So what we do is we plug the apply material after our geometry, and we then use our constant as our material. And we'll do the same thing. We'll use the same node for our sphere. So we'll go apply material after our geometry, and we'll plug our constant in as our material. So that's just the basic constant plug into the apply material. But another thing we could do is we could build on this shader network by using some additional shaders that are located in the geometry. I'm sorry, in our 3D menu. And those shaders are basic material. We have Fong and diffuse, specular, similar to what you would have in 3D packages. But if we grab one of those shaders called basic material, and if we look at this, it has, if I pop this out, it has control for specular, diffuse, and the shininess of the shader. So what we could do is use this as our basic material. So it's got a diffuse input, an emission input, and a specular input. And for right now, what we could do is plug our constant into the diffuse and plug that in our tree. And I will do the same thing here by plugging the basic material after our constant for the sphere. So now we just have this flat texture colors to these two pieces of geometry. So now what we want to do is add some 3D lights. And to do that, the lights are located in the menu under its own menu, lights, but we could also just call out for them. So we could just say grab lights. And if you look at the lights, we have the option of doing a point light, a directional light, and a spotlight out of the lights node itself too. And what we could do is I'm going to clone our scene node, and I'll put a scene node after our lights here. And I will plug this into our scene node here as well. So I'll do one more scene node. And I'll plug in our lights into our scene tree. And now right now we're not really seeing this influence. We're seeing the dark ground, and that's mainly because of our light direction. So what we could do is change this light type to directional, and you could already see the specular component of it, and that light is pointing directly at our object. So we could use the rotations from our lights, and we could rotate this light around. So right now we could give it a little bit 3/4 lighting right there, and I'm going to change the angle of this light. Let's go negative numbers. So what we could do right now, we're getting some light influence on our ground. We'll do something like that for now. So it's about 82 in Y and minus 61 in our X rotation. And we could also bring up the intensity if you wanted to, just so you could see the ground. But right now I'll just put it to 2. And if we're looking at this right now and we go into 2D space, we don't have anything outputted in 2D because everything right now lives in 3D space. So if we want to view this into a 2D world, we're going to need to render this. And the way we do that is using a node called scanline renderer. So we'll add a scanline renderer node. And it's got 3 inputs. It's got our object and scene, camera input, and a BG input. So what we're going to do is we'll plug in our object scene, and then we'll plug our camera into the camera input. And the last input, BG, we don't necessarily need to plug in anything into this, but sometimes you could use a constant or a reformat node in as the BG input just to make sure the output resolution matches your scene. But for right now, we don't need to worry about that. So now if we view the scanline render node and go into 2D space, you could see we've got our scene rendered. And if I disable our lights, you could see the influence goes away. And now we could modify our light a little bit more in addition to our shader. So what I could do is put the intensity down to 1. And we could adjust our basic material here. So if I double click the basic material for our sphere and pop this out, what we could do is, for example, we could bring the diffuse component up. So we could go to like 0.28, and maybe we could bring our specular down, or the opposite direction. We could go up if you wanted to, and we could bring the shininess down, and the maximum sheen for it can become higher as well too. But for right now, we'll just leave it at that, and let's see if we could adjust the basic material for our ground plane. So we'll go basic material here, and maybe we could increase the diffuse on the ground. And based on the angle of that light, we're not really getting much specular component on that, so we'll just leave it. And what we could do now is add another light in here, and there's no limitations on the amount of lights you could have in this scene. So if we were to duplicate our lights and go into our 3D scene, what I could do is grab another scene node and apply this to our lights. And we could plug in this second light in here just so we could start adding in another light here. And maybe what we could do is set this one to a point light. And let me zero out the rotations. Let me boost the intensity just so we could see what we're working with here. And what we could do is raise this light up just so we could see its influence. Yeah, something like that. We could have this light kind of close directly overhead, and maybe we could have it come forward a little bit more. Something like that. And then we could bring the intensity back down to maybe 1. And now if we combine this with the directional light we had, so there is our original directional light, and this is our added point light. And now if we look at our output, we've got influence from both lights. So there's our point light up top, and then this is our directional light. And now what we could do is modify our shaders a little bit if we like. So we could reduce the diffuse on our ball, and perhaps we could, what we could do is boost the specular, take it to 0.7, and increase our minimum sheen, and broaden our maximum. We'll go down to like 7. And then let's do the same thing with our ground plane. We'll bring diffuse down a bit, and we could decrease our specular. So we'll just go maybe 0.35. And we'll set the maximum sheeniness to 18.5. So there you have it. There's some basic shader setup and basic lights with our 3D geometry out of Nuke. And again, we could disable these lights and you could see what these light influences are doing. So that's just basically a quick little intro on these setups in Nuke with its basic geometry and shaders. And in the coming videos, we will look into using these with our 3D assets from our Zilla scene.